Welcome to the 15th lecture in the series that was started 9 years ago, the Dorothy Thompson Civil Liberties Lecture Series to honor the late Dorothy Thompson. I'm Robert Littrell, member of the committee, welcoming you tonight. It should come as no surprise that a lecture series dedicated to civil liberties would look to the resources and assets of the American Civil Liberties Union for speakers and talent. We did so from the inception of the lecture series, beginning with Nadine Strawson, the president of the ACLU, who inaugurated the series in 1994. Tonight we have Anthony Romero, who is the executive director of the ACLU, and he'll present his talk on the state of civil liberties. The American Civil Liberties Union is our nation's guardian of liberty, working daily in the courts, legislatures, communities to defend and preserve individual rights and liberties guaranteed to people under the Constitution. Since its founding in 1920, the nonprofit, nonpartisan ACLU has grown to over 300,000 members. It had a very large influx of members after the civil liberties intrusions that were made in civil liberties after 9/11, such as the Patriot Act, some of the provisions. There was a large reaction to that, and the ACLU grew by large numbers. Our speaker tonight joined as executive director just days before 9/11, and so he had his work cut out for him from the start. Anthony Romero is an attorney. He's had a public interest background. He's been with the Ford Foundation Human Rights and International Cooperation Program. He served with the as an officer for civil rights and racial justice with the Ford Foundation Program. He's come to the ACLU with lots of talent and enthusiasm. He was born in New York City, graduated from the Stanford University Law School, and had his undergraduate at Princeton at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs. Would you please welcome Anthony Romero?
I want to thank you for that kind introduction. The only instructions I gave to my colleagues who sponsored this lecture series was that the introduction should be short. I always insist, it's the most painful part of any trip I make when I sit there and I hear these long introductions and these long bios, and I appreciate the fact that we kept it very short and sweet. I have much on my mind, and I wanted to share with you some of my initial thoughts, and then I wanted to make sure that you begin to formulate your questions, your comments, your doubts. I want you to kick the tires on much of what I say. I want you to engage me in a robust debate and dialogue, and we'll go for as long as you have energy. I promise you that. I wanted to congratulate the Kansas State University for convening this community-wide lecture series dedicated to the memory of Dorothy Thompson. There's a great need in our country for exactly that type of public discussion, especially now that we are engaged in a crucial test. That test is whether we, the political descendants of Jefferson and Madison, and the citizens of the world's oldest democracy, whether we have the confidence, the ingenuity, and the commitment to secure our safety without sacrificing our liberties. For here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, at war against global terror. And terrorism is for sure a new and different type of enemy. We learned this firsthand when on September 11th, a group of terrorists attacked us here at home, and within the space of minutes, murdered 3,000 innocent civilians who were going about their everyday lives. Some have noted that the war on terror is the fourth world war in modern times, the third one being the Cold War, which I remind you dragged on for many years. But if the war on terror is going to be a similarly drawn-out global conflict, and there is already proof and evidence that it in fact will last a very long time, then we must be ready to defend liberty, for freedom cannot defend itself. We as a nation have no trouble understanding the necessity of a military defense. But there is also another equally powerful defense that is required, and that is the defense of our Constitution, the defense of our most cherished of liberties and freedoms. Now put aside popular culture, which changes by the day. Put aside the urges for material success, which is now vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the flagging global economy. Strip away all that which is truly superficial. What is left that distinguishes us, if not our constitutional values? These values of freedom, of liberty, of equality, of tolerance, are the very source of our strength, and they are the bulwark of our democracy. They are what define us as a nation. They are what have permitted us to grow abundantly and to absorb wave after wave of immigrants to our shores, reaping the benefits of their industrious energy. Now, surely the terrorists understood the true source of our strength, and some would even suggest that it influenced their plan of attack: to come to our shores, to enjoy the openness and freedom of our society, and then to strike us terribly. This they did in the expectation that they would not only cause horrible damage in lives and property, but also to destroy our confidence in the liberty and freedom that are the hallmarks of a free and democratic society. And let's stop for a second and think about the word terror and what it actually means. Terror is not only meant to destroy and to kill, but it's also meant to intimidate a people, to force individuals to take actions which are not in their best interest. And if we allow the most cherished of our values to be eroded in the name of terror, then the terrorists will have won. I suggest to you tonight that we are in fact in danger of allowing ourselves to be governed by our fears rather than leading with our values. How else can I explain to you the actions of a government over the last year and a half that has been intent on curtailing the rights of immigrants and intent on invading the privacy of our personal lives, all in the name of national security? We need to stop and consider the direction in which we are headed. For if we allow security to trump liberty, we are surely headed for a national defeat. We are not, however, the first generation of Americans to confront this clash between security and freedom. In 1798, the government of President John Adams feared that sympathy with the radical ideas of the French Revolution would plunge the U.S. into upheaval. Driven by fear and also by his political ambition, the Federalists enacted the Alien Act. The Alien Act, which empowered the president to deport any non-citizen he judged dangerous to the peace and safety of the U.S. And while that act was never enforced, it did have an intimidating effect on free speech and the right of freedom of association. The Federalists also enacted the Sedition Act, which prohibited the publication of false and scandalous and malicious writings against the government with the intent to foster contempt or disrepute of its officials. Now, the Sedition Act was enforced and proved to be an effective weapon in the suppression of dissent. During the Civil War, the country was again torn by deep division and violent protest. President Lincoln feared that the violence in the streets and in the cities would impede the movement of Union troops, and therefore he suspended the writ of habeas corpus and imposed martial law. Without habeas corpus protection, civilians were imprisoned by military authorities and were denied the right to a prompt judicial determination of innocence or guilt. The estimates of citizens detained during the Civil War ranged from 13,000 to 38,000. Then came the First World War, where there was once again strong domestic opposition to the war and to the draft. Many citizens at that time believed that the government was less interested in making the world safe for democracy, as President Woodrow Wilson promised, than in protecting the investments of the wealthy. And fearing that dissent would undermine the war effort, the Congress, with the President's support, passed the Espionage Act of 1917. And this piece of legislation, intended to prevent espionage and sabotage, was instead used by aggressive federal prosecutors and compliant federal judges to mount a full-scale assault on free speech. President Wilson also established the Committee for Public Information, which encouraged patriotic citizens to report on neighbors they suspected of disloyalty. The Justice Department prosecuted more than 2,000 individuals who had expressed views critical of the war, and the judges were quick to hand down severe punishments. Shortly thereafter, Congress enacted the Sedition Act of 1918, which severely restricted any expression of views critical of government, of the Constitution, of the flag, or military forces. And then, just as the First World War was ending, a series of bombs exploded all across this country. 33 bombs in 8 cities. One bomb went off even on the doorstep of the man who was Attorney General at the time, a man called Mitchell Palmer, killing the deliverer of that bomb. And Mr. Palmer, fearful of the impact on law and order, fearful of the enemy within, fearful of the rise of a force overseas that was hostile to American interests and to the American way of life. Remember that the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened the year before. All of this context made Mitchell Palmer quite fearful about the context, and he unleashed the full fury of his Justice Department. To deal with the crisis, Mr. Palmer appointed a very young and very energetic J. Edgar Hoover to gather information about radical organizations. Mr. Palmer and his FBI, with Mr. Hoover's help, conducted raids in more than 33 cities and arrested more than 5,000 people on suspicion of radicalism. more than 1,000 individuals were summarily deported. The radicals at that time were Germans and Poles and Russians, and individuals of Jewish descent. They were the suspected radicals of their time. They were the ones that the government were fearful were going to cause the collapse of law and order. Now fast forward now to the Second World War. In 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. declaration of war, President Roosevelt signed an executive order authorizing the Army to designate military areas in which any person may be excluded. Over the next 8 months, 120,000 Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes in California, in Washington, in Oregon, and in Arizona. A full 2/3 of those 120,000 individuals were American citizens. No charges were brought against them. No hearings were held. No one was told where they were being taken or how long they would be gone. This population, representing more than 90% of all Japanese Americans in the country at the time, was sent to crowded internment camps where they remained for 3 years before being released. This drastic step was taken in response to widespread fears of Japanese espionage and sabotage. And only 2 days before President Roosevelt signed the executive order, Attorney General Francis Biddle, who opposed the internment, that Attorney General opposed it, informed FDR that there was absolutely no evidence to support the fears of sabotage or imminent Japanese attack. He also cautioned, quote, that various special interests would welcome the removal of Japanese Americans from good farmland and the elimination of their competition, end quote. And yet, despite Biddle's opposition and the opposition of the Secretary of War of Henry Stimson, FDR signed the order. The ACLU challenged the internment before the U.S. Supreme Court, and that decision was lost in a 6-3 decision in 1944. With the advent of the Cold War in the 1950s, public fears were once again fueled by talk of communist conspiracies and of infiltration. And in 1950, in response to these fears, Congress passed the McCarran Act, which required the registration of all communists. President Truman vetoed the act, warning that it would lead to witch hunts. Congress passed the act over his veto. Then in 1954, Congress enacted the Communist Control Act, which stripped the Communist Party of all rights, privileges, and immunities. And public hysteria over the Red Menace swept the nation and led to a wide range of federal and state restrictions on free expression and association. In the first half of the decade, the Supreme Court sided with the government, even going so far to rule that the government need not prove a clear and present danger to justify the suppression of free speech. Yet, by the end of the 1950s, the court began to adopt a more critical attitude, limiting the circumstances under which the First Amendment rights could be limited. In the 60s, during the Vietnam War, there was once again widespread and intense opposition to the war and to the draft. This time, however, the courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, consistently upheld the right to free speech and association. And the most famous of these decisions was the Supreme Court's 1971 ruling that the New York Times and the Washington Post could go ahead and publish the Pentagon Papers, a classified study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The government had maintained that publication of those papers would seriously compromise national security. But while the courts were upholding the First Amendment, the FBI was busy elsewhere. It was conducting a counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, an operation that secretly compiled political dossiers on more than 500,000 Americans. In 1976, when the full extent of domestic spying came to light, it was sharply condemned by Congress. When Congress understood that the FBI had kept dossiers on American presidents and their families, on civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, the outcry was strong. And Attorney General Edward Levy, under enormous public pressure, instituted a series of guidelines designed to restrict the FBI's political surveillance and its snooping on the lives of law-abiding Americans. Now, what can we learn from this quick clip of history? The first lesson I draw is that action taken in the heat of a national crisis to restrict liberty is later regretted and revoked as harmful to the national interest. Let's just go down the list quickly and see what happened. The Sedition Act of 1798. Upon assuming office, President Thomas Jefferson pardoned all those who had been convicted under the act, and Congress repaid the fines. The Federalist Party folded shortly thereafter. President Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. In 1866, a year after the Civil War ended, the Supreme Court ruled that so long as the civil courts were functioning, the president was not constitutionally empowered to suspend habeas corpus, even in time of war. The suspension of habeas corpus remains the one major blot on Lincoln's legacy. Remember this point about habeas corpus. I'll come back to it. The Sedition Act of 1918. In December of 1920, 1 year after the infamous Palmer raids, Congress repealed the act. By 1923, the government had released from prison every person convicted under the Sedition Act. By 1924, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone ordered an end to the surveillance of the political radicals. And over the next half-century, the Supreme Court overruled every single one of its World War I decisions. The internment of Japanese Americans. In 1980, a congressional commission concluded that FDR's executive order had violated the rights of American citizens. 8 years later, it was President Ronald Reagan who offered an official apology and paid reparations to the Japanese internees. The second lesson I draw from this history is that the legal community's commitment to civil liberties is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's a relatively recent development. It took almost 150 years before judges acquired a deep-rooted understanding of the right to free speech and association, and before it began challenging the government's equation of political dissent with illegal activity. The turning point occurred around 1920, following the Palmer raids. That was also precisely the year in which the ACLU was founded. This background should give us a sense of how tenuous the position of liberty has been throughout much of our history, and how easy it would be to roll back the progress achieved in the last 40 years. The third and final lesson from our history is that we need to be guided by our values and not our fears. I want to remind you that the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was approved by three of the greatest names in American liberalism: Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Earl Warren, and Hugo Black. That is the danger created when popular fear and prejudice are allowed to dictate policy, and when even good men and good women lose their faith in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. So given this history, should we be concerned about the present state of civil liberties? The answer, my friends, is a short yes. We currently have an Attorney General who appears bent on curtailing liberty in the name of security. His regressive actions are especially evident with regard to the rights of immigrants and to individual privacy. Let's consider the first of these two areas. After 9/11, immigrants were the first to experience restrictions on liberty. Even as President Bush urged all Americans to refrain from attacks on Muslims, on Asians, on Arabs, FBI agents were combing the cities and combing college campuses for people of Arabic descent or of South Asian ethnic backgrounds. They detained more than 1,200 individuals within months of the attacks. Within 2 weeks, it was 300. Several weeks after that, it was 500. When I met with the head of the FBI on October 29th, it was 700. In the first week in November, it was 900. On November 8th, it was 1,200. And then after November 8th, the Justice Department refused to tell us how many individuals they had arrested and detained. The Justice Department also refused to identify the names of the immigrants they were holding, arguing first in meetings with us and then subsequently in their legal papers to the courts that to reveal their names would jeopardize national security by tipping its hand to terrorists and to Al-Qaeda. Now, what is truly astonishing about this is when you look at the individuals who have in fact been charged with relationships to terrorism, when you look at the individuals that the government has detained, the government has been quite quick to point out who they are. It's been quite quick to show us their photographs. It's been quite quick to tell us where they've lived. We know about Mr. Moussaoui. We know about Mr. Reed, the sneaker bomber. We know about Mr. Lind, the American citizen. We know about Mr. Hamdi, the Saudi descent man who's an American citizen. We know about Mr. Padilla, the Chicago-born American citizen arrested on American soil who has yet not been charged with a crime and who has not been granted access to his lawyer. That's the case of Mr. Padilla. You have the case of Mr. Ujamaa. You have the Buffalo cell, that they were quite quick to tell us who they were and where they were living and what their neighborhoods and their homes. All of these individuals who have in fact been related or alleged with connections to terrorism, the government has been quite quick to point them out. Yet the 1,200 plus immigrants who have not been charged at all with any tie to terrorism must remain faceless and nameless, because to give us their names would be to tip the hand to Al-Qaeda. Now, when we initially asked the FBI for the names of the immigrant detainees, and they denied us the names, we of course had to go to court, arguing that these names are part of an open democratic society, that a government of the people and by the people and for the people should be visible to the people. And so we sued the government in Washington, D.C. for the names of the immigrants who have been detained. But we also undertook a second tactic. We knew that at the time when the U.S. government was quite concerned about the war in Afghanistan, a war in which it needed international solidarity and international assistance, that it was not about to run the risk of alienating their very allies. So we had a hunch. We had a hunch that at the time when they needed international solidarity, that the government was likely to comply with the Vienna Convention, a piece of international law that says when a foreign government detains a national of another government, that the detaining government must inform the home government of the individual. So we had a hunch that while they were fighting us tooth and nail for the names of the detainees, we had a hunch they were probably providing these names to the embassies and the consulates of the individuals from their countries. And so we wrote to the embassies and the consulates. And from them, we did indeed get a list. We got a list with names. We got a list with the dates of arrest. We got a list even with the alien file numbers of the immigrants who had been detained. There is no way, my friends, that the embassies and the consulates would have had access to the alien file numbers of hundreds of immigrants who had been detained had that information not been provided to them by the American government. So we received this information from workers in foreign embassies and consulates who had the farthest thing from a security clearance. Releasing the names to you and to me, to the American press and to the American public, that would be contrary to the American interest and national security. But releasing the names to low-level workers in the embassies of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Egypt was apparently not a security risk. And from them, we got the names of the individuals who had been detained. We then went into court a second time, because in addition to keeping the names hidden, the government closed all deportation hearings. Not some deportation hearings, not some aspects of deportation hearings. They closed every single minute of every single deportation hearing, period. They closed to members of the press, closed to members of the public, closed to family members, and even closed to members of Congress. And in that series of second lawsuits, we argued, let judges judge. Let judges judge on a case-by-case, fact-by-fact basis on what part of what hearing should be closed. Clearly, not all information should be available to the public. But don't have a blanket closing of all these deportation hearings. Let them do their job, is what we argued. And lo and behold, to Mr. Ashcroft's surprise, we won one of those cases. We won a case in the U.S. Court of Appeals in Cincinnati that argued that the secret deportation hearings were unlawful. This judge, Judge Damon Keith, wrote, quote, "A government operating in the shadow of secrecy stands in complete opposition to the society envisioned by the framers of our Constitution." He went on to write that democracy dies behind closed doors. That was a clear victory for us. In a second lawsuit, in a very similar set of circumstances, in Philadelphia, the judges sided with the government. And because we lost one case and because we won the other, it makes it very likely that these cases will come before the U.S. Supreme Court as the first 9/11 cases that the U.S. Supreme Court will have to decide. Our work has not been just limited to the legal arena. After we got the names of the individuals from the embassies, we tried to track them down, to document their stories, to paint the human face. That if we kept this debate only in terms of abstract principles, in terms of checks and balances, in terms of due process, we might win the war and lose the battle of hearts and minds. So we wanted to help the American public understand what in fact was at stake, who was in fact being detained, under what grounds. And we hired a documentary filmmaker who interviewed many of the men from the detention centers. Some she got on camera with the film crew. Others, they called her collect, where she tape recorded their conversations. She tape recorded many conversations of individuals who did not understand why they were being held. One man was held for 22 days without any charge at all. Another man was held for 66 days without charge. One man was denied access to his lawyer for 3 weeks. They all professed their innocence. And they all then said how much they loved this country, that all they wanted to do was to be let out, to go back to the land of promise and of freedom. In the months subsequent to their arrests, most of these individuals were deported. And we were fearful that, in fact, with their deportation would go many of the stories of the civil liberties violations that they endured. And so we tried to track down the needles in the haystack. We went back to the embassies and asked them now for the names of the individuals who had been deported with forwarding addresses, if they had them, in their home countries. And from the Pakistan embassy in particular, we got a list of almost 80 individuals who had been deported with their homes and their addresses back in Pakistan. And then, this was Mr. Ashcroft's biggest nightmare, because he thought he would wipe his hands clean of this difficulty by deporting them. We were able to demonstrate to the Attorney General that there is a global movement for human rights that does, in fact, work together. And we turned to the ACLU equivalent in Pakistan, a group called the Pakistan Commission for Human Rights. And we sent them the list. We said, these are the individuals who are now back in Pakistan. Won't you please help us find these needles in the haystack? Won't you please help us interview them? Document precisely what happened to them. And they found 21 and counting detainees who had been forcibly removed to Pakistan. The interviews we have with them are heartbreaking. Before their detentions, these people were indistinguishable from previous generations of immigrants who had come to our shores. They had been cab drivers, salesmen, housewives, individuals who had sold newspapers and candy, individuals with children in homes in America, who were grateful to have lived in a country where they thought they could achieve a better life and live in freedom. Their detention, the interview showed us, put an end to all that. They described anxiety-ridden days which turned into weeks, which turned into months in many cases. Few had been charged with crime at all. Many had been deprived access to counsel. 8 of the 21 we interviewed were married to U.S. citizens. In some cases, the U.S. government ignored the citizenship rights of their spouses or of their children. And back in Pakistan, some of the American children, some of the U.S.-born American children that we found, were failing in school. They were unable to speak the language. They were miserable in a country they did not know. And they asked very poignant questions of the ACLU staff about why had they been thrown out of America. The plight of these families was featured on CNN, on National Public Radio, and on a front-page story with the New York Times, a reporter who accompanied us in this research project. By making Americans aware of what happened, of what in fact was done in the name of national security, we scored one small victory for liberty. The struggle, however, continues. The INS has announced a controversial immigration tracking program that is exacerbating the problem of detentions of immigrants. In December of last year, the INS used the first stage of this new documentation process to round up hundreds of Arab and Muslim men on minor immigration infractions, many of which were caused by the INS's own incompetence. The agency in Los Angeles, for instance, detained 1/4 of all those who sought to comply with the new requirements of the law. Now, the INS says that a tracking program is necessary because we need to track information on who is in the country and who is here legally and illegally. But the real problem for the agency is not the shortage of information, but rather its inability to process the information it already has. You might know that more than 200,000 change of address forms sent in by immigrants are piled up in an abandoned limestone mine right here in Kansas City, Missouri, right in this area. That mine doubles as the world's largest records facility. As these forms pile up, as the INS fails to input those forms, hundreds of thousands of people are put at risk for precisely the wrongful arrest and detention I just described to you. The second area of concern is individual privacy, as I mentioned. Shortly after 9/11, Attorney General John Ashcroft proposed a program in which ordinary citizens would spy on their neighbors, hearkening us back to the days of Palmer. The program, which was called the Terrorism Information Prevention System, would have recruited postal workers, phone and cable installers, the UPS man, truck drivers, individuals all across this country who would come into your workplaces and homes, and if they were to see some reason to be suspicious, would call in those tips to the Justice Department. Few people in Washington or Congress knew about this proposal because it was buried in the very end of the administration's Homeland Security bill. Had it not been for the tenacious efforts of ACLU lawyers, no one would have sounded the alarm, and tips might have become law today. Here was the government attempting to reach into the homes and lives of law-abiding citizens, and doing so without any public debate, doing so without any public discussion about the consequences for our constitutional right to privacy. When we realized what was happening, we contacted the national media and we alerted the ACLU members all across this country. The reaction was incredible. Members of Congress from both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike, criticized Operation Tips. Congressman Dick Armey became outraged when he learned that the Tips volunteers were referring calls from the public to the Fox network's America's Most Wanted TV show. I wish I were making it up. I am not, I assure you. It was only then, when he and others began to sound the alarm within the Republican Party, that the administration had to quickly backtrack and remove Operation Tips from its bill. There was a second proposal that had brewed, that came to light in the public. That was with a program called Total Information Awareness, a new super surveillance program that would use technology such as data mining to track the daily activities of Americans, to use data that the government had in your government files and your IRS returns, data that was available in private databases, your credit card, your medical records, your travel records, to compile profiles of what they thought were suspicious individuals. Put in charge of this illustrious program was none other than Admiral John Poindexter, the paragon of honesty and respectability, who you will remember was convicted 5 times for lying to the American public and lying to Congress, was the highest ranking government official in the Iran-Contra scandal, and only after he was given immunity for his testimony, and only after his record became clean, did they put him in charge of this Orwellian program. The ACLU and other groups sounded the alarm once again on the Total Information Awareness Project. And again, we were able to galvanize members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to raise the questions about its impact on civil liberties. A unanimous Senate also agreed that the new technology could not be used against American citizens without prior congressional approval. We won that for now. It was a time-limited win. And with the rapid deployment of the Total Information Awareness Program may have been stemmed, the question we should ask ourselves is, why are these initiatives being proposed in the first place? Why are we even debating programs like Operation Tips and Total Information Awareness? How far has our government gone in believing that these would be tenable proposals to put before Congress and the public? But it's not relented. The Transportation Security Agency, TSA, has now worked up a new program called Computer-Assisted Passenger Pre-Screening System, which is being tested at selected airports. The CAPS program assigns a code to the level of security of each individual airline passenger. You might be a red, you might be a yellow, you might be a green. None of you would ever know how or why you were coded in such a way. Under the new CAPS program, you would not be allowed to see the information used to determine if you are a security risk. And yesterday, the Wall Street Journal has just leaked that paragon of liberal radicalism. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story on the no-fly lists, which we fear are tied to these government data mining efforts. The no-fly list, which the government has quietly introduced shortly after September 11, which the list compiled by the Transportation Security Agency compiles from intelligence and law enforcement sources individuals that are thought to pose an imminent danger to airline flights. The TSA sends this list to airlines, and their job is to make sure that nobody on the list boards the airplane. That includes one of our clients, a woman called Sister Virginie Lawinger, a 74-year-old Catholic nun who went to the airport to board an airplane to Washington, D.C., and was told that she was on a no-fly list. Surely you must be mistaken, Sister Lawinger asked. They said, no, you cannot board this plane. She asked, well, how did I get on this list? How do I get myself off this list? No answers to those questions. We had to sue on her behalf to get answers to those questions. Two activists from San Francisco, two peace activists, who again went to the airport, asked why if they could board their plane, again told they were on the no-fly list, also told they could not fly, and not given the reasons why. The airline's screening process is resulting in many false positives, and innocent passengers who are denied flights or are subjected to unnecessary law enforcement questioning because their names are mismatched on those lists. Some of the innocent individuals have done nothing else but disagree with the government. And the TSA, the Transportation Security Agency, insists that the new, more advanced CAPS program will reduce the instances of mistaken identity. Now that sounds good, but we have to ask, how will that reduce the cases of mistaken identity? How will we, by scouring not only the no-fly lists, but also criminal records, credit card transactions, other commercial databases, how will we be sure that the government has the right names on these lists? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that invading privacy to such a large extent is likely to increase, not decrease, the number of false positives. It's going to increase the number of unfounded suspicions and may even result in the targeting of more passengers. In the last month, we heard again that the Justice Department was working on a new piece of anti-terrorism legislation, a piece of legislation that they called the Domestic Security Enhancement Act. A piece of legislation, now this one 86 pages as compared to the 346 pages of the first USA Patriot Act, which truly took our breath away. Under this 86-page draft legislation, the Justice Department would be able to wiretap citizens for a full 2 weeks before bothering to ask a judge for a warrant. This new law would shelter federal agents who are engaged in illegal surveillance from criminal prosecution if they're doing so at the say-so of high executive branch officials. Now think about it. That would have made the Nixon wiretappers legal. Another provision would terminate court-approved limits on police spying. Limits that have precluded local police departments from keeping dossiers on the lawful activities of American citizens. A fourth provision, remember the term about Lincoln and habeas corpus? Get this one. This provision would abolish fair hearings for permanent residents convicted of minor criminal offenses. For legal permanent residents would be denied hearing and exempt those cases from habeas corpus review. And probably the most remarkable of the proposals, there is a provision in the draft legislation that would strip American-born citizens of their citizenship if you unknowingly give material support to a terrorist organization. It doesn't matter that you were born here in Missouri or Kansas. It doesn't matter that you were born in Idaho. It doesn't matter that you were born in New York. They will strip you of your citizenship if you wrote a check to an orphanage in Chechnya. And even if you didn't know that orphanage was on the government's terrorist list, they would like to strip you of your citizenship. Not hold you criminally liable, strip you of your citizenship rights. Again, the question, my friends, we've got to ask is, why are these proposals even being considered? If I had given you this list of horrors 3 years ago, most of you would have thought I was out of my mind. Most of you would have accused me of being hyperbolic, of being exaggerated, of crying Chicken Little. But now I can point to the provisions and the draft legislation, and we have to ask ourselves, why does our government feel that it can even ask these questions and suggest these policies? In 1954, when Congress enacted the Communist Control Act, stripping the Communist Party of all their rights, only one senator from Tennessee dared to vote against it. At the time, Irving Howe lamented that the congressional stampede to trample liberty in the name of security and in the name of destroying its enemy was doing us more harm than good. If we learn anything from our history, it is that in time of war, America must be both safe and free. A democracy thrives only when its institutions and when its organizing principles are vibrant and meaningful. In that sense, the Constitution is a living document, guiding us in good times and in bad. We as a nation are at a turning point in our history, and many have surely commented on the transformative nature of September 11th. And it's hard to disagree that our country has not changed in some significant way now that we are no longer immune to the furies of foreign events. But we also have to remind ourselves, my friends, we also have to remind ourselves of the transformative nature of 1776, of 1787, of 1791, with the Declaration of Independence, the signing of the Constitution, the ratification of the Bill of Rights. For Americans, these must remain our key transformative events. These must be the events that shape how we see the world and what we understand our role to be. Sometimes we modern Americans have a hard time appreciating just how revolutionary the whole notion of democracy was. That a people could embrace freedom under law as a goal and agree to be constrained by a constitution and by a political system of checks and balances. That was perhaps a radical, maybe even a foolhardy goal in 1776. But what gave these early Americans the confidence to become the first modern people to confront the full challenge of democracy? It was perhaps their understanding that citizens of a republic could be counted on to work out the details. That democracy, after all, is a demanding enterprise requiring our constant attention and our dedicated effort in peace and especially in times of war. We have a right to question what our government is doing in our name. We have a right to engage in robust and full debate. We have a responsibility as well to do so. That is a legacy that our founding fathers left to us, and upon which we must build so that following generations of Americans will live in freedom and in human dignity. If we here in this auditorium dedicate ourselves to this great endeavor, the pendulum will move. With our help, it will gain momentum and swing vigorously toward greater liberty, a liberty embraced by a broader spectrum of Americans and by people far and wide. That is America's vision. That is her promise. That is her strength. It was true in the 18th century, and we must ensure that it remains true into the 21st. That's why I need your help. I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much. Question. Who's got the first question? Thank you. I talked for much longer. I realized you wind me up and it's hard to shut me down. Please, what's your name, sir, and what's your question? Once you come to a microphone, I think they have some mics so everyone can join in the conversation. Up front, up front. And I want some of the students to start thinking of their question. And you might be a student, for all I know. Please.
We are all.
We are all, in fact.
My name is David Garland.
Hi, David.
And in a conversation I had today, a revelation was brought to me, no pun intended, that the administration believes that we are living in the end time, as described by the last book of the Bible. Do you believe that that is their perception?
Yeah. It's an interesting point to try to understand what are the motives and intentions of an administration. My most benevolent reading of some of their actions is that in fact they do believe that they're engaged in a war of good versus evil, and that they feel very strongly that they are on the side of good, fighting the evil forces. And you have comments and statements from the Attorney General that are rather clear about that. You see that in some of the discussions about his work after 9/11 and how he got a new purpose to being the Attorney General. At the Baptist Radio Convention conference, he was quoted as saying that the source of human dignity and freedom is the Creator, capital C, his exact words. And we need to remind the Attorney General that the source of human dignity and freedom in the United States is the Constitution, capital C. And when you find much of their language in ways of good versus bad or the American way of life, you find that in a less charitable moment, that is the most charitable I can be, in a less charitable moment, I find that much of the actions after 9/11 has been pure, unabated, insatiable appetite for greater power. The USA Patriot Act, 346 pages of that law, enacted in 6 weeks with very little comment, very little debate. Members of the House and the Senate will openly tell you that they didn't even read it. Some of our best senators would say to me, Anthony, we didn't read it, we couldn't oppose it. To oppose it would have been un-American or unpatriotic. We need to stand behind the president, and 6 weeks, we need to just enact this piece of legislation. It went too far. It went too fast. It was too broad. There are so many provisions of the USA Patriot Act that have nothing to do with terrorism, that fundamentally erode the system of checks and balances and allows this shrouding of secrecy behind government actions. When you look at what they put in the USA Patriot Act, none of that was new to us. None of that was a surprise. These were all policies and proposals and ideas that had been lying on shelves prior to 9/11. And they pulled them all off, and they put a nice veneer of anti-terrorism shellac over it, and they rammed it through Congress with no debate, no dissent, no discussion. And that's why we've got to ask ourselves, as the American public, of people who just engage in the political process, we have to require that our elected officials ask the tough questions. And the most basic threshold question we've got to ask is, were law enforcement officials using their extensive powers on September 11th? And if not, why not? We need to know what broke down before we can figure out what to fix. We still don't have answers to those basic threshold questions. And you have now members of Congress, you have not just Democrats, you have Republicans like Mr. Sensenbrenner, you have others who are beginning to ask the questions about how the government is using these USA Patriot Act powers. So when you ask me on the least charitable moment, my most cynical moment, I think it was just pure, it was a complete power grab. They exploited people's fear and their anxiety. They knew that the public would not be willing or able to ask the tough questions. And our political leaders followed rather than led. And that's why we have the law we now have. Please, what's your name?
My name is Woodway. In reference to the Domestic Security Enhancement Act, Patriot Act,
Yeah.
you talked about citizens losing their citizenship. Now I have a question. Did they lose their citizenship? Like, I know they get accused of abetting terrorism in some way. Now, did they have to go through like a court of law, like with a judgment of a jury, and then they get stripped of their citizenship?
It's not clear. It's not clear. And some of the details would have to be sorted out. And now already you have Mr. Ashcroft, who's trying to back off of some of these provisions in the law. That piece, that draft legislation was leaked to us by someone within the Justice Department. And only when they got their hands caught in the cookie jar did then the Attorney General say, I wasn't really suggesting this. I wasn't really considering this. I was at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing when Mr. Ashcroft, Mr. Mueller, Mr. Ridge were all testifying almost a month and a half ago. And Mr. Ashcroft, when being questioned on this issue, precisely on the citizenship issue by Senator Feingold, said, I wasn't involved in the drafting of this draft piece of legislation. I didn't know about it. Don't hold me accountable for it. These are just discussions and debates we're having within the Justice Department. Now, first off, even if you believe his words, which I don't, not one of them, not in that sentence, and probably not many of them, it strains credibility that the Attorney General would be uninformed, would not be consulted, would not be involved in a process, not be apprised of a process where you have some low-level Justice Department official in the bowels of the Justice Department drafting legislation unbeknownst to the Attorney General. If that is true, something is broken in the Attorney General's office. Now, it strains credibility that he was not involved with it. And that's why when you actually look at what's in the Domestic Security Enhancement Act, it is literally a fix for every single one of the places where the government has gotten its knickers in a twist. So the case I was telling you about before, Mr. Padilla, they really do have a conundrum. And boy, it's a vexing one, I'm sure. It must keep him up at night, you can only hope. That he arrests an American citizen on American soil, doesn't charge him with a crime, doesn't grant him access to a lawyer, labels him an enemy combatant, and he's fighting like hell to convince a judge that that's okay. And he's having a very hard time of it. Judge Mukasey is giving him a run for his money. So the way to question, the way to fix that difficulty of holding an American citizen without charging him with a crime and without granting access to a lawyer is you don't make him a citizen anymore. That's what really I think is the impetus and the incentive behind that provision. Please, what's your name? Kathy, hi.
Predate 9/11, I think they got it there. I'd like your comment on, first of all, stripping the voter rolls in Florida, the argument of equal protection under the law, and free amendment zones.
I know I would like some help from the students. I asked the president of the university today about free speech zones. He said that he does have a free speech zone, and then I was told, well, does that mean that the other zones are not free speech zones? And he told me that they are all free speech zones. So I'm quoting him, and I'm giving that information back to you in case that should help you at all. Because I don't understand why you would have a free speech zone if the other zones are all free speech zones, and the whole country is a free speech zone as far as I'm concerned. But I just, you know, it was useful for that clarification. I don't mean any disrespect, of course. The purging of the voter rolls is one of the places where I've been most frustrated. I was appointed 2 years ago this month in April, and I officially began my job on September 4th, as you know. In the month interim between my appointment and when I officially took over, I was really quite keen on what I thought was an enormous amount of momentum that we could tap for electoral reform. That there was so much of the American public, all the letters I got initially congratulating me and encouraging me or criticizing me, they were all pointing to the Bush v. Gore debacle. And that felt that there was a lot of ferment that could be tapped. And I thought that for sure we could use that malaise and that disquiet over how our nation's election system did not function at the last presidential election as a way to unroll and to roll out a whole new series of electoral reform proposals. And frankly, that's one of the casualties of 9/11. That before 9/11, there were many in this country who were willing to say that president was not a democratically elected president of the country, and that he was, and that we had these purges on these lists, and that we had large numbers of African American men who were purged from the voting ranks because of prior felony convictions of nonviolent offenses, and that there was so much fundamentally broken with the way that our democracy was functioning. And I was for sure convinced that we would see progress in that area. And frankly, my friends, it's something that we're going to have to come back to. And we're going to have to see if we can reignite some of that malaise and see if we can remind people precisely of the questions you raised. So it's a long-term battle. I will go on this side. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was looking to my right, not politically, but sorry.
My name is Tyson.
Tyson, hi. How you doing?
Freshman in information systems and industrial labor relations. I had a question regarding the Japanese internment cases such as Korematsu. Do you feel that the arrest and detention of certain citizens of the United States, like we talked about, is an example of another internment?
You know, it's a great question, and we've tried very hard to, even when we cite the history of Japanese American internment, it's important not to conflate the periods because they're distinct. The internment of 120,000 Japanese, two-thirds of them American citizens, was just one of the most egregious moments in our nation's history. And we can all look back with a little bit of self-righteousness and say, how could they have allowed that to happen? And you actually go into the ACLU archives and you read the minutes of board meetings at the ACLU where good civil libertarians, I mean good people of good heart and minds, debated either side of the debate, saying that it was a military necessity and that it was just anathema to what we were all about as a country. And as an organization, we were one of only two organizations in the country who stood up nationally to oppose internment of Japanese Americans. It almost broke us in half. And we lost that case in Korematsu. And we think now, self-righteously, well, how come it wasn't clearer to our predecessors there? And I think the case with the arrest of American citizens, you have now two individuals who fall specifically in that category. Mr. Hamdi, the Saudi descent American citizen, he's an American citizen of Saudi descent, who was apprehended near or around the battlefield and then brought to Guantanamo. And when they figured out he was an American citizen, they brought him into the Fourth Circuit. They both brought Mr. Padilla and Mr. Hamdi both into the Fourth Circuit. For those of you not the lawyers in the room, the Fourth Circuit is one of our more conservative circuits. They were clearly forum shopping. They thought they would get a cakewalk on bringing them there. The earlier case on Mr. Hamdi, the government had a quite tough time convincing the judge. It was on appeal that the judges on the appellate level gave the government the win and the success. And now we're in that case as well. We'll probably all file before the Supreme Court. We're seeing to see where it goes. The case of Mr. Padilla is still playing out, where the judge, Mr. Mukasey, in the Second Circuit has said that he has a right to confer with his lawyer. In a rather stinging opinion, when you really want to get heart in the whole concept of the checks and balances and of an independent judiciary, read two opinions. Read Mukasey's opinion and read Judge Damon Keith's opinion. You see that the judges are having the backbone to ask some of these questions. Whether or not when it moves up the food chain to the Supreme Court we'll still have that challenge, it will be an open question. The reason why the Padilla case is, for me, significant, it's not of the scale of 120,000 Japanese Americans. You're talking about one or two isolated instances. But the reason why the Padilla case is significant is that you're taking an American citizen on American soil, and you're not giving him the chance to confront his accusers, and you're not charging him with a crime at all. And if you give the government the power to do that in any case, then there's very little to stand in its way when it chooses to pick you up and hold you without any charge and not give you access to a lawyer. That's why we've got to be worried. Because it's crossing a line we dare never cross in a free democracy. That's why I'm worried about it. It's a different scale. Darren, okay, I'm sorry.
And I just wanted to bring back, you mentioned you heard John Ashcroft talking, quoted, about a new purpose after September 11th.
Yeah.
And as a Republican senator, I mean, I don't know, but when he was it Thompson? Anyway,
Yeah.
I assume that he would have been at least more libertarian in his views than he has been as an attorney general. I don't know.
Yeah, no. There are some within the Republican Party that have very strong libertarian views and who have sided with us. I mean, this is one of the places where the ACLU has had some unusual bedfellows. You know, we've joined with Dick Armey and Bob Barr. They don't agree with us on many of the issues that I care about, but they agree with us on the question of surveillance and Patriot Act and privacy issues. We've formed common cause with individuals like Phyllis Schlafly or Grover Norquist. But Mr. Ashcroft's record is rather clear from the beginning, even when he was here in this state and elsewhere in the Senate, that his concern has been other than a concern for civil liberties and civil rights. I can get you more of his background. The quote that I want to leave you with him, and then we'll go to other questions, because I know, and I have an infinite amount of energy, especially for the students, so I'll stay for as long as you can, until you kick me out. Until you call this a no-speech zone, I will. The quote that really alarmed me was in December of 2001, 2 months after the terrorist attack. The Attorney General goes before the Senate Judiciary Committee and says, to those who conjure up the phantoms of liberty, you give ammunition to America's enemies, pause to our allies, and diminish our national resolve. Those are all three exact quotes of his statement. It was astonishing. Astonishing. What was most astonishing is I sat there watching the CNN broadcast in my office, and I was ready for one of the senators to take him on, to say, Mr. Ashcroft, you're the person who's being unpatriotic. How dare you question our patriotism because we engage this process? You took an oath. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution and the First Amendment. That, for me, was one of the greatest harbingers of what was to come. And I think every fear has been yet realized.
I was just curious, if your roles were reversed, how do you feel you might behave through it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's probably the toughest question I've been asked in a long time. I think I would start by thinking that it's not safety or freedom. It's got to be safety and freedom. If you have safety without freedom, you have a totalitarian regime, you have a dictatorship. If you have freedom without safety, it can be anarchy, it can be chaos. You need both. You need all three words, safety and freedom. And I would think as an Attorney General about what policies and what procedures advance both. And there are some that do, and there are some that have advanced both. And we need more policies that advance both of them. But to posit it as an either or, as a false dichotomy, is the wrong way to go. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then I'll just wrap up by trying to weave them all in. So why don't we go here and we'll go to the two. Do you have some questions, please? What's your name?
My name is Nara Subramanian.
Hello.
I have a small question. I don't understand this for 20 years in Kashmir.
Yeah.
Almost 25,000 people have been trained here, but in the Pakistan, indirectly, of course, Al-Qaeda was also there, the direct support of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or any other Muslim countries in Yemen. Now, I come from a country where, unfortunately, I have to see day by day. I'm also actually from a country that's the largest democracy right now in the world.
Yeah.
How are we going to balance the actual balance between safety and the freedom you're talking about? Because right now what I found is INS, as you correctly say, they're very screwed up. I mean, right now, a package, because I have to know, they took like 10 different fingerprints out of my hand and they mapped like a green card 4 years back.
Yeah.
And 2 years back, they tell me I'm not in the system, I'm an accidental labor person. That's
Yeah.
not the problem.
Yeah. No, it's
But the thing is, in this process, unfortunately, we do have to look into it. We are citizens of the country, not to protect freedom. We need to give some religious freedom. I know it's difficult, and I'm also a student member. And for me, it's extremely difficult what John Ashcroft is doing.
Yeah.
I'm not personally a big friend of this, or even
Right.
one of the doctors, but I mean, I'd like to ask you what your organization is doing in this regard.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I got to ask you to stay with me, no matter what, no matter how much you might think I draw the line in a different place, no matter how much you disagree with the ACLU positions on what we do or don't say. I need you to stay with the organization. You remain vocal, because there are no easy or right answer to these questions. Where you might draw the line between safety and freedom might be in a fundamentally different place than where I would draw the line. But what's most important is that we have a dialogue and a debate about it. And that's why the statement of Mr. Ashcroft earlier was my biggest worry, that we would not have that discussion, that debate when you need it precisely. And there are places, I agree with you, that there's a lot that within the INS that needs fundamentally revamping. There's also other security measures that advance both goals, and we have to start with those. For instance, when people say, well, what would have stopped 9/11? Fortifying the door between the cockpit and the main cabin would have stopped 9/11. That was not a new proposal. That was a proposal that was on the table for years prior to 9/11. You know, proposals that require the training and the screening of airport workers so that people working on and around the airplanes are precisely the people we expect them to be, also balances safety with freedom, advances both. The efforts to check the air cargo containers that come into the nation's ports. This I'm quite passionate about, because my office, I have a view of the New York Harbor, and I see all of these ships lined up like a parking lot, waiting to pull into New York Harbor. And then you read the reports, and they only check 3% of those containers. Now think about if you only check 3% of immigrants coming into this country, or 3% of the luggage on airplanes. And so there are efforts that we very much want the government to begin to undertake that advance both. But efforts that use race and religion as a proxy for suspicion, efforts that treat Muslims and Arabs and Asians as the potential enemy, as guilty until proven innocent, I think we have to draw the line there. But your question is the right one, and you've got to stick with me. Please.
My name is Rob, and I was wondering about your thoughts on the correlation between the war on drugs and the war on terror.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And the interactions between
It's great. Do you want to also ask your question? Go ahead, please. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, please. What's your name?
My name is Rachel. I was curious about your opinions on the future of our judicial system.
Yeah.
Bush's proposed during his campaign that he wanted to appoint strict constructionists
Yeah.
to the courthouse, and what you think about that. Do you think that I don't think it would really happen.
Yeah.
Not
Yes, he would. Yeah. We'll talk about it, Rachel. Go ahead. Why don't you take the third question? Yeah. Yeah. These are great questions. This is why I love talking at universities. I mean, of all the places, I love the ACLU membership meetings, but these are really the best meetings I have. And these last three questions, I think, give you a really clear sense about how, there's so much hope when you're asking these questions. I will sleep very well tonight, I promise you. I mean, your first question, Rob, about the war on drugs and the analogs to the war on, it's Rob, right? The war on drugs and the war on terror. It is exactly the analog that Tom Ridge drew. In fact, in one of his quotes, he said, "This is more like the war on drugs." And we should have all just sat up and said, "Oh, God, I don't try to use that word very often. It's in my job description to use it as little as possible. I'm teasing. But it's remarkable with the idea that when you think about the fact that we have now 2 million people who have been arrested and detained in this country, who are in federal and state penitentiaries and detention centers, most of them for nonviolent drug offenses, most of whom are in fact racial and ethnic minorities. The kind of the racial profiling aspect of the war on drugs, the disparate treatment between individuals of wealth and individuals who are white and individuals who are minority immigrant communities. That's precisely what we have to be worried about, what will play out in the war on terror. Because people, the white Anglo-Saxon businessmen, are not going to find themselves as often on these no-fly lists as the individuals who are immigrants or who are Muslims or Arabs. And that we will become accustomed to the level of profiling and government surveillance and government action that has been justified in the war on drugs. And both of them have a very clear ring of righteousness. There is a morality that undercuts both. That it's good versus evil. That it's, and that we've got to be very, very concerned about. Moral clarity. And we have a long and a large program on drug policy litigation. We have a number of cases. We just won this great case in Michigan where welfare recipients were being required to submit themselves to drug testing. And we won in Michigan, saying, no way, that should not be allowed, that people on welfare should be required to do drug testing. We have one case of 5-year-old Native Americans in a public school were sniffed by drug guard dogs. And one of these little boys in the classroom was so terrorized that he lost his composure, he peed in his pants, he was absolutely traumatized by hosts. 5-year-olds because of the war on drugs. And that's why we've got to ask ourselves, before we get down that path much further, what's happening and what will happen to cities. The point on judicial nominations, Rachel, I think is the right one. I mean, one of our greatest concerns is that because the federal appointments are lifetime appointments, because by their nature you want to have an independent judiciary that's insulated from the whims of political favor. That's what makes the branch independent, the judicial branch independent. But what you find is an effort to overtly politicize judicial nominees, where there are political litmus tests that are used on candidates about which way they might or might not vote. And what's been most troubling for us, and especially in this round of the Bush appointment, has been the fact that they are consciously looking for judicial candidates for whom there isn't a written record. You know, at least with just the Supreme Court Justice nominee Bork, there was a full record, and there could be robust debate, and people debated it. Do we want a man with Mr. Bork's views sitting on the nation's highest courts? And we knew what he thought. We knew what he thought about all these sorts of issues on reproductive rights and choice, on gay rights, on affirmative action, on race. We knew what he was thinking. And we could have an honest debate about, does that person represent our values the best? The strategy, however, having lost the Bork debate, the Bork battle, they have now backed themselves into naming individuals for whom there is no record on them, where you have as little as possible, where your objections can't be substantiated in front of the Senate, where you can't educate the American public about what they really believe and what they don't believe in. That, for me, is probably among the most pernicious parts of it. And the Supreme Court is so significant because, as I referenced for you, so many of these decisions break down on 6-5. You know, I mean, they are always decided by very small margins, the way the court has been politicized. 5-4, I'm sorry. And you're tired. I'm tired. And you can see why, in fact, it's so significant to have justices who represent the values. And at least we can engage that process. The final question. Remind me, I'm blanking on it a bit. Oh yes, the media. Now you wind me up for the closing. Go back to the first statements coming out of the White House on the media. You remember when the White House made a request to the news outlets that it not broadcast the tapes of Osama bin Laden? Do you remember this? When they were saying that they were fearful that the tapes would have secret messages that would help activate these secret sleeper cells in our midst. They had no proof. They just made the assertions. It wasn't censorship. No, it wasn't censorship. But it was a request that they not broadcast these tapes. Now, what was remarkable is that I watched those tapes. I watched them on my TV in New York City. I watched them on the Spanish language station, you know, the Mexico City station. I just clicked on the cable channel and I saw the tapes of Osama bin Laden, and I saw the same tapes on the internet where you can watch them on the internet. It just strained credibility. There was no way that if Osama bin Laden was going to get those messages out to his secret troops, not running them on the networks wasn't going to stop them from getting to the individuals who wanted to watch them. I watched them, and I wasn't one who was particularly interested in any secret messages. But the fact that the media didn't issue a peep, there was no discerning analysis of, well, wait a minute, is this really going to ensure the safety of the country? You had the media who very much caught up in the same jingoistic stand behind the president, unified behind the president. Look at the articles that got published in the first months after 9/11. Letters would come pouring in from ACLU members saying, where is the ACLU? What are you doing? Why aren't you saying something? My letters I would send out, we are saying, we are speaking out. We filed lawsuits within 6 weeks of the terrorist attacks. We were trying to testify before Congress. We were trying to stop the USA Patriot Act. We couldn't get coverage of these issues. And then the coup de grace, for me, this was one, I've learned this one. We raised money to run a television ad campaign because we were having such a hard time getting the media to cover the stories the way we wanted it to. I figured, okay, we're going to run television ads. That's what you do in a democracy. I went out, raised the money. I convinced a Hollywood producer to give me $1 million. We produced fabulous television ads, 3 television ads. We put them in front of focus groups. We tried to see which ad would help move public opinion. One of them bombed. One of them did well. The one that did well, we tweaked further. The one that did well is my favorite ad. It's the one with, it shows a torso of a man in a blue suit, red tie, white shirt, in front of the Constitution, and where he sees we the people, we the government. And then he sees the First Amendment, and he scratches out the First Amendment. He sees the Second Amendment, he puts a little star behind it with an exclamation point. Second Amendment's on the right to carry guns. He cuts out the Fourth Amendment, he crumples it up. The right to a jury trial, he gets crossed off, and it says you have a right to a military tribunal. It's a great ad. And, you know, then the voiceover says, look at what John Ashcroft is doing to your Constitution. It's great. It gets people to sit up and take notice. It moved people's public opinion. And I thought, we're finally in the big leagues. Now I've got this TV ad, it's worked. Let's buy the airtime. Do you believe that the color of my money is as green as Enron's, and I could not buy the airtime on networks in New York City and in Washington, D.C.? They will not sell it to you. These are not public service advertisements. These are merely paid advertisements. I didn't ask for any break. And they will not sell it to you. They won't tell you why. They just won't. Those are our nation's airwaves. Those are a public good. Those are not owned by Rupert Murdoch or all the kind of the telecommunications magnates. Those are our public goods, just like our lands, that have been licensed to them. And yet the idea that you can't put on the idea of free exchange of ideas, a robust debate, was just truly astonishing. The story, I come back, I'm a lawyer, but I haven't practiced in 12 years. I get this message, and I go down to the legal director of the ACLU. I said, sue them. Get me a lawsuit. I want to just sue them, sue the pants off of them. And they told me that it was not so simple, that they had the right to decline us, and that if they had given me some reasons why, then I could use that possibly in a court. But the fact that they declined to give me any reason why they wouldn't run it, I have a hunch. I think you do too. I want to thank you very much. I'll stay around for a while longer. I want to thank you for your attention and for staying with me.